Hi, everybody. Hello, everybody. Welcome to this talk today, Journey into Fear, Horror as a Vehicle for Healing and Transformative Play by Yeonsoo Julian Kim. My name is Josephine Baird. I am going to be your host for the evening. This talk is hosted as part of the Transformative Play Initiative series of talks here at the Uppsala University Department of Game Design. The talk today will be recorded and it will be shared on YouTube. The talk is going to be about an hour long with about half an hour for questions and answers. If you have a question that you'd like to ask during the evening, please put it in the Q&A tab in the bottom bar. That way you won't get lost if you put it in the chat or anywhere else. So please use the Q&A bar and I will ask your questions for you at the end of the talk. It's a real pleasure to meet Yeonsoo Julian Kim. I've heard plenty about you, but I haven't met you before. It's a real pleasure today. Very excited to hear about your topic, a topic that's close to my heart. Even if I get nervous about horror, I'm always particularly attracted to the topic and its potential for healing and transformative play. Yeonsoo Julian Kim is a game designer, a writer, and cultural consultant who works in tabletop games, LARP, and interactive fiction. They received a master's in interactive telecommunications from New York University in 2015. Some of their games include the interactive horror novel The Fog Knows Your Name, published by Choice of Games, and the storytelling game Women Are Werewolves, published by Ninth Level Games. Their best known LARPs are But Not Tonight, The Long Drive Back from Busan, which won a Golden Cobra Award, and The Truth About Eternity, which debuted at Festival 2019. So please join me in welcoming Yeonsoo Julian Kim. Over to you.
Thank you so much. It's great to meet you, and I'm very excited to talk about this. So let's jump in. There we go. We covered most of that just now, but I figured it's always good to have one slide about what work I've done. And the first two, yes, are the LARPs that I'm kind of best known for, and then No Such Place as Koreatown, which I'll be touching on a bit during this lecture, is specifically an adventure setting for kids on bikes, which is a tabletop role-playing game that draws a lot of inspiration from Korean supernatural like beliefs and phenomenon, and specifically Korean American instances of that. And then I'm also currently working on another role-playing game called Home, with Doug Lewandowski, and that is about exploring a haunted house. So I'll be touching a little bit on those things, but mainly I'll be looking at other people's work. And to start off with, there's two particularly important terms I wanted to cover before launching into things, since they're very applicable to what I'm going to be talking about. And the first is emancipatory bleed. So if bleed is the phenomenon where part of your real life self kind of seeps into the fictional character you're playing, or vice versa, whether that is personality traits or behavior or emotions and relationships. Emancipatory bleed, to quote Janaea Kemper, is the feeling of liberation that comes from being able to fight back against or succeed against systemic oppression, or allows you to notice those things that have held you back. For example, when a male player who was routinely bullied as a child for being emotional, plays a character who has the ability to freely share that emotion without being bullied for it, or when a player notices that they are no longer afraid of speaking their mind at the office or taking up space in public after playing a person in charge at a LARP. So we're going to be talking a little bit about how fear relates to that and how that can be a transformative experience for players in a horror game or in a game that uses fear-based play. And then the other important term that we're going to be using is alibi. And to quote Sarah Bowman, who's here, this is in which players accept the premise that any actions in the game are taken by the character and not by the player. So in the context of horror, this might be, oh, I only left your character to die out in the woods because that's just what my character would do. It's not really my action. Generally, the stronger the alibi, the weaker the bleed. And when you play a character who's like yourself, the chance of experiencing strong emotions also are generally higher. So yeah, what is fear-based play? So I mean, it's very general, but the general definition is it's play that is meant to invoke play or fear in the players. So it's the idea is that it's intentionally designed to do that, or the player is steering their play in order to experience fear. A game does not need to be a horror game to incorporate fear-based play. I've certainly experienced a lot of scenes that are very, very heavily emphasize fear-based play within games that were not at all categorized as a horror game. But we will, for the sake of this lecture, be focusing largely on horror. Your character might be scared during fear-based play, even if you, the player, are not, or the opposite might be true, where you, the player, might be frightened, even if you've decided that your character is not. And the game's theme of fear, it could be tied from pretty much anything from the supernatural to natural or man-made disasters, or the threat of violence or loss, and then plenty of other things that I did not list there. And so, yeah, the main kind of question that we're going to be tackling in this lecture is, how can horror be healing? Because it seems, on the outside, that horror and being frightened might actually be the opposite of a healing experience. But the key factor that makes horror games scary is also the thing that gives them the potential to be healing, and that is player agency. And it's interesting in horror games specifically because having agency in general can be empowering, but in horror, it's also forcing participants to examine and manage their fight or flight instincts. And when we talk about agency, the reason I have an icon here of a partially open door, which normally wouldn't seem that sinister, except for we're talking about horror now. So of course it's taken on a sinister look, is that opening a door when something scary might be behind it is kind of a quintessential image in all of horror media. You see it in trailers for movies. It's something that you might do in a video game with horror. And then when we're talking about analog role-playing games, if you're sitting around a table playing a tabletop game, you're describing how your character might approach a door with something terrifying behind it. While in a LARP, you might need to really physically act out opening that door and seeing what's behind it. And that can feel very differently all throughout these different mediums. And we're going to touch on that a bit. So dive in a little bit more about horror and how it can be healing. Very important kind of disclaimer is that it isn't healing for everyone. It's not a one size fits all situation, as the same can be said for a lot of scenarios in role playing. And not everybody is interested in horror for its transformative aspects. Some people just enjoy being scared for the fun of it or thrill. But for those who are interested in it, agency in horror games gives us the power to face our fears in a controlled environment. And that's kind of the primary element of this. I'm going to feel personally more empowered, for instance, if I choose to hold a spider rather than if I wake up with a spider on me. Because this is a choice I've made to engage with this fear rather than having it kind of come upon me without my consent. Horror games also have the power to redirect our fear and anxiety for a time. A lot of people with anxiety disorders, for instance, that anxiety can either be very nebulous. We don't know what it's connected to. We don't know what's causing it. It might just kind of not be connected to any one thing in life at all, or it could be something that we just don't have control over, like wanting to make sure that your loved ones are safe at all times, and fearing death or loss, which are just kind of factors of life. When you play a horror game, you get to redirect your fear to something else, and that can actually be a bit of a relief. Sometimes it can feel easier to take on, just a horde of the undead, for instance, than your own kind of fears in life that are a little bit, again, like more nebulous, a little less that you can directly do to challenge it. And that can be a nice outlet for people. Also, I'd say by now it's pretty widely accepted that role-playing games can help people learn and practice social skills, and also therefore manage social anxiety. So it just, it makes sense that it can also serve as a tool for practice, facing other fears such as death, isolation, deteriorating mental health, existential dread, even the threat of destruction of all life. which is something that my LARP But Not Tonight kind of tackles. In many horror games, you're also experiencing trauma with other people instead of on your own. There are solo horror games and horror games that will kind of ask you to go off on your own to have an experience. But many games, you're in the situation with a group of people. Real life traumatic events can be extremely isolating, even if you are in the thick of it with others, because everybody's in survival mode. Their priorities are shifting to just getting through the crisis, and that can be a very lonely experience. But when role-playing traumatic events with other people, there's usually a sort of agreement or social contract in place that you are here to experience these things together, and to witness other people's ordeals and to have them witness the ordeal you're going through. And just the act of being witnessed can be incredibly healing for people who have felt unseen in their trauma before. Even if the trauma in the game is not identical to an event that you experienced in real life, just simply having the experience of navigating something awful with other people can serve to ease anxiety around the thought of having to endure trauma in life at all. For many people, there's just a healing quality to togetherness in a harrowing situation in and of itself. And yeah, in horror games, there's also this aspect of comfort when being able to interact with people out of character, either in between in-character scenes or after the game, and also before the game, obviously. But that brings me to a quote that I always like to bring up when I'm talking about horror games, even though it relates to horror films, which is from a paper from Pop Culture Journal. Horror film special features fulfill a unique role and service to the genre by providing the audience comfort and closure for issues that the narrative itself may leave unanswered. In this way, horror film special features are fundamental to the genre's successful functioning. And I would argue that that cathartic element of the special features, of getting to see people who are playing these terrifying characters or victims, just chatting with each other normally, having a laugh, even seeing how the whole thing was made, you have even stronger access to that, to the kind of behind the scenes of what was making you frightened when you're playing a game, because you have the other players who you can talk to out of character and have that real moment of recognizing that they are also people. They're not actually tortured spirits or monsters or victims of like a terrible disaster as you were playing. And if there is a GM, for instance, if you're playing a tabletop game and there's a game master, you have a chance to talk to them and ask them about the decisions that they made. And it kind of demystifies the experience, and is almost the ultimate de-rolling exercise, which we'll also talk about de-rolling a bit when we get to debriefing. So what does agency actually look like in a horror game? On a very broad definition, I mean, it could be choosing to confront a threat or hide from a threat. It's choosing to discover more about a threat or to avoid paying attention to a threat. And more specifically, that could look like, choosing to attack something that has invaded your home, or instead choosing to hide in a closet. Choosing to be the person who wants to use the Ouija board to communicate with a spirit, or trying to be the character who's discouraging everybody else from doing so. All of those are choices that you get to make within the framework of whatever game you're playing. The important thing is that agency in horror games is present, but it's limited. And that limitation is kind of the key factor that's going to give any horror game its atmosphere and tone, and kind of decide what that game is about, so to speak. Players are forced to make the most out of what they have, even though they have these limitations. So those could be physical resource limitations, or it could just be that the threat that you're up against is some supernatural thing and it's almost all powerful, and it's going to try to make you do whatever it wants you to do. And so your options are very limited, but you can choose to try to confront it with your words, or to continue to try to survive, even though it seems impossible. Those are all ways to exercise agency, even if it doesn't seem necessarily as powerful as if you were playing a superhero game where you have powers, and the idea is that you'll be able to defeat the big bad thing no matter what. Players are also often given the power to solve their problems in some way, shape, or form while in a horror game, but it often also requires doing the last thing they want to do. And again, to look at these things more specifically, limited agency, I always think of survival horror, which is something that's generally, when you talk about survival horror, you're talking about a video game most often, but I've seen games that I would classify as survival horror, both in LARP and tabletop as well. And the idea behind survival horror is that you're not using weapons, really. You're not trying to fight back against the threat because the threat is just too powerful. Instead, what you're trying to do is just survive either the night or the week or the experience. And you have some options about how you want to approach that, what you think is going to give you the best chance of survival. But it takes away the fight part of the flight or fight instinct. Likewise, with the bad choices that a player might be confronted with, they might have the agency to choose between sacrificing a friend who was bitten by the undead or choosing to save them while knowing they'll pose a risk. Both of those things seem like bad choices, but you still have the agency to try to choose which one you think is going to turn out better. And also, a character might, for instance, also be given the option to save a loved one, but it requires confronting a demon on their own. So it could, or you might want to go save somebody and you're afraid of the dark and it requires you to go into a very dark room. So you have the option, there is a possibility, a path to follow in order to get what you want, but it does require you to confront something that terrifies you. Sorry for my squeaky chair. Which then also brings us to a really important theme that is in a lot of horror, even if it's not explicitly about that, which is horror and existential dread. Even when a piece of horror media isn't explicitly, again, about existential dread, the genre is so closely linked with the concept as a whole that it's kind of hard to avoid this topic at all. The threat of death is almost always present in horror. This means that the characters and then often the players must grapple with the question of, how far are they willing to go to fight for life? And then once that initial primal drive to survive is just completely worn down, characters and again, maybe players have to answer this question of why it is that they want to survive, aside from just that initial animal instinct of course I want to survive, I'm a living being and it's programmed into my DNA to want to survive. Coming up with an answer to this question of why do I want to live when it is so hard to live can be generally like the most monumental part of a player's experience in a horror game, because it reframes this experience, this terrible ordeal that you're going through, so that it's centered on making you focus on what's worth living for, and having that be the thing that drives you and gives you the power to make use of your agency. But also I add this important note here because it's good to be aware of. This question can also be extremely fraught for players who have depression. So it's important to very clearly advertise when a game heavily features existential dread and is going to make you kind of confront these questions, so that players can self-select into that game or not. And I wanted here to just kind of provide some questions for designers that will help them while writing a transformative horror game. And again, a lot of this has to do with the idea of agency and how it's going to be used. But what agency will the players have? Is their fate predetermined? There are some games, such as 10 Candles by Stephen Dewey, which we'll be touching on in a bit, that have the players know from the start of the game that the game ends in death for the characters, and there's no way around that. There still can be empowering moments within that experience of play, but he wrote the game in such a way that he wanted players to know that from the start, so that they could steer their characters in a way that felt right, knowing that even though they had that dramatic irony of people as players knowing the fate, while the characters still think that there's hope. And that dramatic irony can give players a chance to feel empowered, because then they get this chance to design their own demise instead of having a game master or somebody else dictate for them what is going to happen to their character. Also, another important thing is, how are you going to signal what agency the players have? Because the thing with horror often, and with many games, I'm sorry, my rabbit's making so much noise. The thing with horror games, though, is that it can be hard for players to know what they can and cannot do within the game world. So is the threat something that can actually be vanquished in some sense? Is this going to be kind of an action horror game in which there is going to be combat of some sort or some kind of confrontation in which the players can win? Or is that just off the table? Is that not supposed to be the point of the game? It's important to give players kind of a clear idea of what their parameters are for the game so that they're not having to guess at what they can or cannot do, especially in horror where the horror aspect can kind of fizzle out if the player characters get a little bit overpowered. So figuring out how those options are going to be signaled, like is the NPC just going to outright tell them? Are you going to outright tell them out of character before the game begins? Is it presented as a puzzle? Or is it just going to be very open-ended and facilitators will kind of figure out what works or not along the way? It's good for players to know what the system for figuring that information out is from the start. And then if your goal is to create a transformative experience in a horror game, you need to reflect on what opportunities for transformation do you want to provide, and to get fairly specific about that, because the more specific you get, the more you're going to be able to fine tune that and kind of get the outcome that you're looking for. Whereas if you take a very broad approach, often it's kind of like if you don't know what target you're aiming for, it's hard to hit it. And again, like with horror especially, it's very rarely a one size fits all situation. So something that will work really well for you and for a lot of the other players, might completely miss the mark with another group of players. And that's fine. Not every game can do everything for everyone. I think it's really important just to accept that as a game designer at all, and as a player. But the other thing to think about is, how does the threat that is present in the game world potentially reflect the trauma players are going to be processing during this experience? So for instance, is there a monster who represents an abusive parent? Is there a ghost? Is that the threat, or one of the threats, a ghost that represents that we are ultimately powerless against mortality and that we all eventually succumb to death? And by tackling the themes that this ghost represents, we'll be able to kind of process our own feelings about our mortality. Is there a vampire that represents our fear of losing control, either to rage or lust or any kind of like just basic instinct? You're going to want to kind of figure out how the themes that you want to tackle to help people process real life trauma or just issues, how they're going to manifest as a threat, usually within the game. And then there's some questions I wanted to provide for players who want to reflect on how they can have a transformative and or healing experience before a game even begins. And one of my favorite questions to reflect on for that is, what is the worst thing that could happen to my character? And is there any way to empower them, even if that fate does come to pass? And to use an obvious example of character death, maybe the character has to die, but I had to figure out a way for my death to save others. And that's what I want to aim for my empowering moment. Or maybe my character has to die. And the death, it doesn't help anyone, because that's how a lot of deaths are in real life. But I get to die with dignity, or I get to fight back against the threat. And so at least I go out with some form of hope, or by using my agency. Or honestly, maybe my character dies a terrible death, and I just allow them to scream and be miserable about it and cry and express that true emotion instead of forcing them to be a stoic hero, because that's also another way that I could use my agency, just to allow that character to go out in a way that is real for them and true, instead of them trying to go out like a hero who doesn't really care that they're about to die. There can be an empowering moment in that. And again, it's not going to be a one size fits all situation. People need to figure out what's going to mean something to them. And then I also want to think about how much alibi I want to have in this game in question that I'm about to play. And do I want to try to process a real life fear, or a fear that is maybe adjacent to a real life fear? So like, for example, you might not want your character to have one of your real life phobias, but they might have another phobia that they have to contend with in a similar way to how you contend with yours. And you can work out some of your own thoughts and feelings about your real phobia while not having to actually tackle it specifically in the game. But you can still learn a lot from that experience. And I think it's always a good idea to know with yourself how to tell if the experience is getting to be a little bit too much. And at what point, what signal will there be? Is it something that I'm going to feel in my body? Is it a thought that I'm going to notice that is repeating in my head? At what point am I going to say, okay, I need to pull back? And so it's always good to know how to set boundaries with yourself in that way. And it's also helpful for the other players so that, you don't end up pulling them into something that they weren't prepared for if you end up hitting your point of kind of no return emotionally. Also, I think another important question is the real life trauma that I want to explore through role-playing, is it older? Have I already had time to process it? Or is it very recent and I haven't had time to really understand how it impacts me fully? And I don't know necessarily every single thing that will bring up feelings regarding this drama. Am I ready to tackle this topic essentially in a game? And do the other players know that I'm drawing from lived experience? If so, they don't necessarily need to know if it's, because everybody will draw a little bit of something from their real life, but if it's something that's very fresh, for instance, I think it's generally a good idea to have a conversation with the other players that you're playing with closely. Again, game sizes are going to vary wildly, like if you're in a giant LARP versus if you're at a table or in a small freeform or black box LARP. And even though we are talking mainly about tabletop and LARP here, I did want to touch on a little bit of how horror can be present in immersive theater and haunted house attractions to kind of highlight how much more room we have in tabletop and LARP. Which is, in immersive theater, we all know it's generally, and again, there are productions that are different than this, but generally speaking, things are happening to you, and the world and the narrative are not very reactive to what you're choosing to do with your agency. It's capable of being a highly immersive experience because often there's been a lot of focus placed on making the environment very realistic and atmospheric. And often, there might be a very high production value, so everything just like looks amazing, and they, made everything smell a certain way. But so immersion might be very high, your brain might be a little bit more easily convinced that the threat is real because there is this realism present, but you can't really do a whole lot with that as a character, because usually you're not actually playing a specific character. You're there either kind of as a nebulous idea of yourself or as just a vague presence in the room, which can lead to a very low alibi experience, except for there's not a lot of ways to integrate the fact that you are having a low alibi experience, since again, your agency is generally pretty weak. And then that just gets amped up a whole lot when you're talking about haunted house or other haunted attractions. I know in the US specifically, we have a lot of very extreme ones where the idea is really just the designers want to scare you and that's about it. You're not there to have a transformative experience, except for to see how scared you can get. And again, like they do this through jump scares and atmosphere. They're going to sometimes find out like personal information about you, like just like what your name is or something. They'll do this sometimes by looking at your social media to try to scare you by showing that they know you. So again, it's a kind of a weird use of low or not, in this case, non-existent alibi. But again, even though we have this very low alibi situation, you have very little ability to interact with the environment or the narrative or the other characters in any kind of meaningful way. Things, again, are just happening to you, aside from when they might ask you a question that you have to respond like yes or no. In contrast to that, with tabletop role-playing games, the game world is extremely capable of being reactive to player choices, again, within the constraints of the rules and the atmosphere and tone of the game that people want to set. But For instance, in a video game, if you try to knock on a wall because you think there's something creepy about this wall and you want to approach it and see what happens, if nothing is programmed to respond, then nothing is going to happen. You might still scare yourself because you have that anticipation of going to knock on the wall, but that's about it. And even in a LARP, unless someone who is facilitating has foreseen this as an option or advertised that this is something that people might want to do, and they've placed themselves kind of behind this wall to knock back, you're not going to have much of a result in your attempt to approach this creepy wall. In a tabletop RPG, however, the GM can have somebody or something or whatever is behind that wall knock back or slam into the wall or whisper something terrifying through the cracks, or start running to the door in order to pursue the players. You have a whole range of things that could happen. It's pretty much anything that you could think of since you're just narrating the outcome. Also, speaking of narrating outcomes, in tabletop role-playing games, players are narrating how they use their agency and speaking in the third person. Granted, you're not speaking in the third person generally all the time, although some people prefer to play their games that way. But speaking in the third person often enough can act as a sort of safety net because it creates a distance between the player and character that isn't necessarily there in a LARP. And this is a neutral thing. It's not either good or bad. It can be useful if somebody is interested in exploring a horror game, but they want to have a safety net present because they're nervous about it. And again, like if you want to have a lot of time for reflection while playing the game and having time specifically set aside to think about what's happening out of character, this can be a useful tool for people. And then when LARP, you have players embodying their characters, and more often than not, they have to physically act out how they are using their agency. So, for instance, if we go back to the door kind of scenario of you have a door and there's something scary behind it and you want to go through it, you have to actually open that door and twist the doorknob and go close to it and then enter that room and be inside that room and feel those feelings of being there. So your real mind and your real body might be responding to this fear by freezing up or urging you to run. And you can't, you can't just describe walking into the room. You have to actually walk inside. This is desirable for some people and it's not for others. The body also, it has limits. And when we feel those limits, especially when we're in like our fight or flight instinct is starting to get engaged, we remember how vulnerable we are. So these experiences can be more intense than tabletop role-playing experiences generally. And again, this is not like, I don't want to make a blanket statement about LARP versus tabletop games. These are just kind of generally how things have gone in my experience and what I've read other people's accounts to be like. It's also, I mean, one thing to be aware of with larger LARPs, because when we're thinking about larger games with dozens or, many more people than that, sometimes it can be difficult to calibrate play to suit everybody's needs in these larger scenes. Especially when you have a lot of intense things happening because you're trying to scare people. So black box spaces. So if you're in a black box game, you have control over a smaller space and you generally have control over the lights and sound and stuff. And you can use this in a larger LARP to kind of set aside a special space for smaller groups of players to go and play out a scene that you don't necessarily want a massive number of people there for or an audience for. And this is a good option specifically for players who want to delve into more sensitive topics and they want to have a little bit more control over that environment. And then I wanted to touch also on solo games because there's been a rise in solo games that are available. And these are often taking the form now of journaling games. So they come as like creative writing prompts. Sometimes it's like an advent calendar style where you get a new prompt every day. Sometimes it's take an hour or two and just write in a journal using these prompts. Sometimes it is just telling you to go sit in a dark corner and reflect on the prompts given to you. But they tend to be a little bit of a mix between a LARP and creative writing exercises. And these are really good at providing players with an extended opportunity to reflect on the themes of this game and to examine their own fear, because you're not pressed for time in the way that you would be if you are in a bigger LARP and you're worried about missing out on something. This is just you and whatever game materials there are. It does sometimes require the player to put in more effort into buying into the experience, since you are only performing or playing the experience for yourself. You don't have this kind of added pressure of there being other people around you. So it can be easy to just say like, oh, well, I'm only going to go half in, which is fine if that's like a boundary you need to set for the experience. But sometimes it's coming out a little bit more out of embarrassment of like, I'm embarrassed to be doing this on my own. So it takes a little bit more willingness to just kind of go for it if that's what the experience you want to have. And then again, these games often ask the player to create a certain atmosphere by maybe they want you to sit in a room with the lights off for a time. Maybe they have a playlist that they want you to play specifically, or they want you to choose something in your house that you're going to make scare you. Like if there was a closet and you're going to decide there's something in that closet and that's going to be the focus of this experience for me. So it often will make you make use of like household objects, for instance. And I did also want to talk a little bit about some of my personal experiences here with integrating some real life fears into horror games in order to have transformative experiences. And one of the keys to having transformative experiences I've found is to not set my hopes so high that it's going to be heartbreaking if it doesn't happen. It's kind of a soft goal I generally set for myself that I find that works. And one of the experiences I had that I wanted to share was about a game called Something Is Wrong Here by Kira Magrann. It's extremely influenced by the works of David Lynch, so it's very surreal. Here I have an image of the cover art for the game, which it's just very interesting, and it definitely gets the surreal atmosphere across because you have a giant figure that doesn't have any facial features except for teeth, and some things that look like trees reaching up to the sky, and a house, and everything is a little bit nondescript and eerie, which gets the mood of the game across quite well. And the real life fear that I decided I wanted to examine when playing this, and this is a LARP that is very, it's card driven, so that you are getting the prompts in the form of playing card size cards. And then you're playing out scenes based on those prompts. But the game, the real life fear I wanted to examine here was my fears of dementia and confusion, because dementia is something that runs in my family, and I'm a caregiver part-time for my grandmother who has it. And so the idea of knowing that that's something that potentially I'm going to have to face for myself in the future is quite scary. But I also have a lot of experience with it and have talked about it in depth with my family and in therapy. So I felt very confident in my ability to approach this in a game setting. And this game specifically features mechanics where characters see or hear things that nobody else does. And they have to kind of confront that of like, oh, did you hear that? Did you see that? And other people have to say no. And so at times in the game, it feels very much like everybody's experiencing a different reality. Multiple people, if not everybody, experiences that at some point during the game. So it's simultaneously very isolating because you see and hear things nobody else does, but other people are as well. And what I found most effective about having a transformative experience with this was that treating it as something that was very ritualized. The game has like very specific things it wants you to do in a very specific order. And it was almost elevating the experience to something sacred. And I hesitate to use this word a lot of the time when it comes to sensitive topics, but it was even romanticized in some ways, which I found actually very comforting. Because when you take something that is a present and very real fear for you, and then you find ways to romanticize it just a little bit, it can dull the edges and actually kind of make you find meaning in this experience. Again, if you're just facing it head on in real life, sometimes it's really hard to take that step back and see those aspects of it. So that was one instance that I wanted to share. Another thing that I wanted to share was one of the games from Suburban Consumption of the Monstrous by Sadia, Bies, and Banana Chan, it's an anthology of what they call house horror LARPs. So it's very suburban themed horror LARPs meant for smaller groups, and it's going to be published by Pelgrane Press. In this game, players are sitting at a dining room table, usually, ideally with a mannequin at the head who represents this character of father. The other option is to have the chair just be sitting empty and representing that father's presence is there. And all the player characters are these young monsters who have been abused by this caretaker father and are having one last dinner with him before they're going to decide to murder and devour him. Players in the game take turns reading from little cards. Again, this is another card-driven LARP, what father says. And before that, they get to write most of what those things that he's going to say are based on prompts. And they're small cards, so it's not, you don't have to write like huge speeches or anything. But if you're playing for Bleed, this writing section kind of before the start of the game is an ideal time to pull from real life experiences, since you can put words in the mouth of this NPC and then you're going to like ritualistically destroy this NPC at the end. And so that's something that I'm specifically very excited to play through and to experience, because I just think that has a lot of potential to be very cathartic. And then I mentioned 10 Candles earlier by Stephen Dewey, and specifically how it helps people gain control over their character's demise. Again, all characters die at the end, no exceptions. And also just to talk about the artwork for this real quick, sorry, because I forgot. We have the table and chairs, and it's dripping blood, and it's kind of elevated above a suburban neighborhood. And there's a giant tooth hovering over the table because, again, consumption here there is a lot of exploration of kind of examining what's eerie already about suburban life through making horror games about it, and kind of emphasizing those things until they become terrible. So the idea of like a nice suburban family dinner has been turned into a rendition of a table overflowing with blood here. Which I think captures the mood of this anthology very well. And with the artwork for 10 Candles, it's called A Role-Playing Game of Tragic Horror as the kind of subheading. And we have characters who are walking through a street at night with flashlights, and there are kind of these alien monsters hovering in the foreground waiting to pounce on them, and it's very dark. And that represents the default setting for the game. Which is that I think the default setting is that there's been an alien invasion of some sort and everybody is being wiped out. But the mechanics of it is that you have these candles that you blow out as things go wrong. And eventually, one by one, once you get towards the end, everybody dies. And this was something that I actually found a lot of meaning in watching. I GM'd this game for a group, and as I was encouraged by the game materials to do, kept making terrible things happen to them. But I actually, even as the GM who wasn't playing technically, found it very rewarding and life-affirming to watch characters who still cared about doing the right thing, even as they steadily started to learn, just as their players already knew, that their time was at an end. And there is just something very, life-affirming about seeing people who are doomed still work really hard towards their goals, even if that goal doesn't necessarily mean their survival. I did want to also talk a little bit about fine-tuning safety and calibration tools for fear-based play. I think it's really important to design for downtime, because some players will just push themselves until they reach their very limit. And that will mean that they're not getting these built-in opportunities to reflect on how they're doing as a person, but then also to reflect on the themes of the game. Because I do believe that having those breaks in between these kind of high intensity scenes is essential to being able to reflect and process the experience, and therefore have a more meaningful experience at the end, as opposed to just going, and never having a chance to kind of integrate what you've learned about yourself or your character along the way. I think also it's very important to have clear tools for players to say no and yes to experiences. And it can be useful specifically to have a variety of tools for that, since some players, for instance, can become nonverbal when they're in particularly intense situations. And I also think it's a good idea to have chances to opt in more so than chances to opt out. So if, for instance, there is an opportunity to engage in a very intense scene, it might be useful to have players travel to a different location to engage in that, instead of saying it's going to happen here, and unless you leave, you're going to be a part of it. Or maybe make them go get a specific prop and bring it back, so that they have to think about it and reflect on whether they actually do want to opt in or not, while going through this little mini ritual of going to the place or bringing back the thing that's going to signal that they want to participate in this. Debriefing is an extremely important part, I think, of role-playing in general, but especially after concluding a horror game, especially de-rolling exercises, because it's good to have there be separation between this fictional person you are playing who experienced terrible things and yourself, so that you can kind of separate the trauma that happened to them from the trauma that happened to you. And also horror games can conclude with a lot of loose ends, which can be difficult for some players, and it's a good time to find closure when you're doing a debrief. And it's also a really good time to reflect on the why of things, because figuring out why you were scared of a certain situation or a certain character or threat can lead to some of the biggest moments in self-understanding after a game. It's also a nice time for GMs to explain some of their thinking behind decisions that they were making, if players are curious about that, because again, it can demystify the experience a bit. And now I'm gonna just take a sip of water because I've been talking a while. I know some people were very interested in this, and I wanted to get into this as much as possible. I know we're starting to get a little iffy on time, but I want to talk about horror across cultures and some pitfalls and other examples of things that might potentially go wrong when trying to integrate horror from cultures other than your own, and kind of what to do about that. But for just talking about horror across cultures, some more obvious examples of what that looks like. I think the most obvious one is that there are culture-specific supernatural entities and monsters out there. For instance, like in China, we have the Jiangxi, we have the hopping vampire, and in a lot of parts of the UK, we have the idea of like a black dog that comes and signifies something terrible is about to happen, usually a death. Locations that are linked to the idea of death or tragedy, often there can be ideas of this area is cursed because of this one terrible thing that happened there, and now terrible things have been happening there ever since. And then also another kind of more obvious example is that local folklore, urban legends will incorporate prevalent natural disasters in that region. And that can also affect the region's cosmology, which can also come into play in horror and themes in various horror games of, what gods have you angered, for instance. Some less obvious examples are when generational trauma manifests as folklore and urban legends, because often urban legends don't just pop out of anywhere. They come from real lived trauma, and they manifest in these kind of cautionary tales in a lot of ways. And also themes in the local horror media that reflect current political situations there and any threats of oppression. There's a lot of work out there about how horror trends in horror reflect trends in politics. And I'm not going to dive into that a whole lot there, but I do think it's very interesting, and there's a lot of material out there to look at. To give some personal examples, since I think it's going to be easier to talk about this when I'm talking about some of my lived experiences. One thing that I've experienced that was not experienced by the predominant population around me growing up, is that I grew up thinking bathrooms were terrifying. And that's a theme that I have integrated into some of the games that I've written and run. But it does take some explanation, because not everybody understands why bathrooms would be terrifying. But for me, it was kind of obvious that they should be terrifying because in Korean mythology, there is a household goddess who presides over the outhouse, and she's terrifying, and she has like long dark hair, and she's really angry all the time, and she's thought to like make people sick, and I think to like kill children by dragging them into the toilet pit, which is awful. And then additionally to that, there are just a lot of urban legends in Korea about ghosts that live inside of toilets and give you awful decisions to make, like what color toilet paper you're going to use, and then they just kill you no matter what you decide. And then these urban legends often take root in schools because, you know, young people love urban legends and they love scaring themselves and each other. And so we have a lot of urban legends, particularly surrounding girls' bathrooms being haunted. But the thing here is that we have to like kind of be aware of is that if I were to integrate this into a game that I was running for you, and then there was another player who thought that was just really silly and decided to kind of make fun of it, there's a lot of territory for things to go badly, because there's a strong argument to be made about the connection between the suicide rate in South Korea and the nature of these bathroom ghosts and where they're said to appear. Because how do we treat bathrooms in schools generally? They're often a place where people go to cry when they're having a terrible day. So there is this kind of, even if people aren't very aware of it, there is a connection between the idea of I'm really suffering and the idea of suicide, and then this idea of bathrooms being haunted. It's kind of morphed in this way over time. Another thing for me that I put into games that has required a little bit of explanation is that for me, the number 4 is scary. In a lot of East Asian and other Asian countries, the number 4 sounds a lot like the word for death. And so hospitals and other buildings will usually kind of avoid putting number 4 on floor numbers or room numbers. I know there was a train that avoided car, they just didn't number a car for 44, I think, because it was just considered too unlucky. And I was taught by my grandmother to not set anything to the number 4, like the volume or the heat on an electric blanket. So I avoid it whenever possible to, you know, and avoid unnecessary anxiety, even if I know realistically, probably nothing's going to happen to me if I set something to number 4. It's ingrained in me. And if I were to be in a game and someone like ridiculed that extensively, that would definitely put a hamper on my ability to have a transformative experience in that game, because I'm instead preoccupied with the fact that I feel like I'm being made fun of for something that's cultural, which comes to why I made a giant slide about this, which is just player empowerment should not come at the cost of disempowering the marginalized in real life. And just some factors to be aware of just to start off here on. Horror and death are intrinsically tied together, and every single person has a personal and a cultural relationship with death. Death also has religious and or spiritual importance to many people, and not everybody is going to be able to put aside that significance for the sake of a shared narrative. This doesn't mean that you have to make games that are going to be appealing to absolutely everyone. It just means that it's very good to signal what is going to be incorporated in your game. So again, players can self-select in and out of that. If you are incorporating a supernatural element in your game, you are, I said almost definitely because I just couldn't, I'm sure there might be some scenario in which this isn't true, but almost all the time, you are also going to be establishing something about the cosmology of your game's world. The presence of the supernatural often implies the existence of an afterlife, for instance, or that souls exist and otherworldly beings and or planes of existence outside of the one that we live on. And this, again, this isn't bad. It's just that we need to be aware of it, since people are going to interface with that differently, and people from different religious or spiritual backgrounds might just react very differently from the model that you're presenting than you anticipated, or they may want to not play in it at all. Another thing kind of unrelated to that, but I thought was important to touch on at least, was that body horror can easily slip into ableism, which can be super disempowering for participants with disabilities, chronic illnesses, or any kind of scarring from illnesses or injuries. And one way to help avoid this is to just make your body horror just completely impossible in real life, and not be something that real people might experience. So, you know, give people animal and insect body parts, or have them turn completely inside out, because that's not a thing that happens in real life. And then this is a little bit more obvious, but I felt it was worth touching on just the same. Horror games often pull inspiration from existing source material, and sometimes that source material has very solid roots in bigotry. And it's important to be aware of that, because the horror that is present and presented by that material may then be rooted in this fear of the other, when the other in question is really just an already marginalized group. The obvious example here is H.P. Lovecraft's work, which we could talk about for a million years, but I still have a lot of slides to go through. Some other potential problems when integrating horror from cultures outside of your own, you're going to want to avoid, both as a player and as a designer trying to figure out what ways to steer players, you're going to want to avoid this idea of like, oh, this thing that you're presenting that's not actually scary. Because a lot of players have this urge to conquer their fear or bolster their ego by proving they're not afraid of something that they're expected to be afraid of. And this means that they can slip into refusing to buy into this narrative that requires that their characters to be afraid. It's fine if this is like a conscious choice that a player is making about how their character responds to a threat, but it becomes more of a problem when it's the player's attitude starting to slip into the character, and it's the player's attitude towards the content of the game, especially when this is aimed at an element that comes from a culture other than the players. It can come off as mockery of that culture and the history, or potentially generational trauma that produced that specific element. Instead, you're going to want to set expectations very early on. If fear is a necessary part of the game, it's okay to tell players that much. It's actually important too. Additionally, you're going to want to avoid this kind of attitude of in players of there's actually a really, really easy way to defeat that, because again, could be another attempt at self-empowerment, but it's cheap. It's a cheap one that often downplays the symbolic meaning of the threat that in the game that is in question. Again, it belittles the cultural trauma that the threat represents, and often it goes hand in hand with leaning heavily on resorting to violence, which, in addition to the problems that can present, it tends to make a game fairly boring if that's all you're resorting to. For example, if you have a supernatural stalker entity who's attacking members of an immigrant community in your game, and then suddenly it's just easily taken down by some white guy with a shotgun like it was no big deal. It kind of downplays whatever you were going for the supernatural stalker representing symbolically. Instead, it's generally good with horror to encourage players to play to lose, or at least to play to struggle. If you're writing a game, feel free to outline very specifically for your players what are appropriate in-game goals versus not appropriate. Because it also gives them a good idea of what the scope is and what the game is supposed to really be about. Additionally, you're going to want to avoid the narrative of, the outsiders come in and save the helpless and or ignorant local victims narrative, which you might be most familiar with because it takes the form of a white savior narrative often. And this, it just reinforces beliefs that those outside of the dominant culture, in this case, dominant culture of the players, are just incapable of helping themselves because they are simply inferior. Instead, if the characters need to be outsiders, they can just fall victim to a threat without having to vanquish it. But if vanquishing the threat is a big part of the narrative that you want to have, consider having the primary victims of it, the local people, play a key role in the process of eliminating it so that they aren't totally disempowered. And this is an interesting one with horror. I highly suggest avoiding diffusing tension with laughter and jokes that are aimed at sensitive topics. And this is kind of can be a tricky one because it's natural for people to want to diffuse fear and tension with laughter when they're scared. But if the laughter is directed at a sensitive topic, that can become harmful. For example, if you are playing a game set in a location where there have historically been many suicides, and then you have your character, because you're feeling a little stressed out about this and you want to relieve tension, you have a character mess with a corpse as a joke or make some kind of rude joke about a corpse. That can be extremely harmful, and it's just reinforcing a lot of bad behavior. Instead, if laughter or mocking behavior would be inappropriate in the scenario that you're presenting, you need to make sure that you emphasize that before the game starts. Workshopping can also be really helpful for this, to set the tone right. if it's happening in the middle of the game and it's not stopping, it probably means it's time to take an out of character break to recalibrate. And yeah, I had a few more points here about respectfully incorporating culturally significant supernatural elements, and they're all taking the form of questions that I think is very useful to ask yourself while you are creating a gaming experience. And the first one is, why do you want to incorporate the specific element in the first place? I think it's just a good idea to have an idea of why you want to incorporate it as your kind of guiding compass for it, because it's okay if it's the idea is just like, oh, I think this is cool, or there's something about this that really scares me and I want to explore that. But if you find that your motivation for it is a little bit, again, you're not sure of it, or there is something about it you just think it's silly, it might be time to back off from it. You want to examine why you find this thing scary enough to want to make a game about it or to create a game experience about it. And to just, again, examine whether or not that scariness can be attributed to some idea of otherness that relates to real life people. For instance, there is a trope out there about how monsters are sometimes depicted as being scary simply because they have dark skin or they're associated with darkness, and that can correlate a lot to just racism, the idea that darkness and dark-skinned people are frightening. And so it's good to like figure out if you're defaulting to that simply because that's what you know. It's good to have researched the historical and cultural backgrounds of this element. It's good to also give players guidelines both for how to interact with the content, or how not to interact with the content, and how to interact with the content. Kind of give them a list of do's and don'ts. You do want to examine if there is supernatural elements present in your game. You do want to examine what it says about your game world's cosmology, and again, making that information very clearly available so players can self-select. Similarly, if your game specifically is about how like it's very existential dread heavy, it's about how there is no afterlife, no God, heaven, hell, no soul. You want to make that very clear to prospective players. And then just lastly, you want to approach the design with intersectionality in mind. Have you established anything in the lore about how, like, for instance, only lower class people believe in this silly superstition? If so, are you just, also discouraging people from playing on that simply as a joke, or is that something that you actually want to examine and look into? Or is this something that you just kind of defaulted into? And then I have here just a lot of different, I highly recommend checking out James Mendez Hode's blog, specifically best practice for religious representation when thinking about the supernatural, because while this is not specifically about the supernatural, it does touch on how religion could play a role in your game, even without you being aware of it necessarily. So I highly recommend checking that out. And then I have more further reading slides for anybody who is interested. And I believe that was our time for this. Yes. And now we go into Q&A.
Yes, indeed. My goodness. Wow. Well done for keeping exactly to time. That was great. And thank you so much for such an interesting talk. We have 3 questions in the Q&A section at the moment. Anybody who wishes to add more, feel free. Otherwise, I'll ask my many questions that I also have from just listening to you. If it's okay, then there's also applause in the chat for you, just so you know if you're not looking. There's much applause happening. If it's okay, then I'll just start with the questions that we already have. Mm-hmm. The first question we have is somebody speaking about creating games. They said, when we started to create with Belarusians, Palestinians, and other groups of people that lived in traumatic situations, they asked us, why use our spare time for dread, horror, and gruesome situations? We want happiness and silliness to have a break from our real life. So their question is, when you've experienced really traumatic situations, or you're still in one, can you play with horror in a way that's still healing? What should we think about if we want to do this? And they note that they're not sure they want to design horror labs about Ukrainian refugees just at the moment, for example. So.
Yeah. Oh, that's a very good. It's funny because this actually reminds me of a question I got fairly recently about my game Women Are Werewolves, which is about sorry, I'm talking so long. Just need another sip of water. which is about being non-binary members of a family that has like very strict and also supernatural gender norms of only the women in this family get to be werewolves, and everybody else the men have to stay at the home and like guard the home. And somebody asked me on an interview, like, man, we have to deal with so much already as like non-binary people and queer people. Like, why did you make a game where you're kind of leaning into the microaggressions that you might be experiencing in this, a fictional family, and having to go through this ordeal when that's what we have to do in real life? And I mean, my main answer is, first of all, I think there should be a million different games about every subject, and that there is no just like one right game about any given experience, whether it's trauma or something having to do with identity. But for me, and for my co-designer, CAS Taylor, on Women Are Werewolves, we very much felt that it was going to be cathartic for us. And then if it was cathartic for us, then maybe it would be for other people as well. And it started kind of as an experiment of, is playing through this real life kind of trauma, because part of it, in this day and age, coming out as non-binary or as a queer person, and especially if you have a family potentially who doesn't quite get it or is just flat out unaccepting, we have a whole range of scenarios in there for that. There's something about being able to play through that in a fictional context that helps you to process it in a way that is hard to process when you're just examining your own life close up, because you can mix in how much alibi you want to have. Like, I'm going to pull these elements from my real life so I can examine that because I feel like that will be helpful. And these other elements, I'm just not going to touch because I'm not ready for that. I might not ever be ready for that. And so Women Are Werewolves is not a horror game. It could be, because there is like transformations and scary woods and stuff potentially, but it's generally a game about gender identity. But it shares a lot in common with horror games. Or my approach to horror games, which is that, again, part of it has to do with that idea of redirecting fear. Sometimes, like, and I just saw something and I will address that in a second. There is something nice about being able to redirect your horror to something that is very fictional. So for instance, like if there are the undead present in your game, or a threat that, and maybe, I don't want to like speak to people believing in ghosts or not, but if you are dealing with a supernatural threat, that can actually feel like, oh, I could compare to what's going on in my real life. I can take that on. That feels actually doable for me. And if you're going to have the anxiety already, being able to channel that into something that seems scary, but actually feels safer than your real life, that can be, and again, it's not going to be for everybody, but that can be very empowering for some people. I wouldn't recommend necessarily diving into something that is a current traumatic situation that is happening and immediately making content about that. I think for some people, if they're experiencing that and they want to channel what they're feeling, what they're going through and their trauma into a creative expression, that's one thing. But there's something different, again, about creating a game about trauma that is something that you've experienced and that you want to potentially share as a tool for other people to work through, versus blanket statement like being able to make a game about something that's like a current event that is still working out. And I mean, again, unless it's a creative exercise for yourself and maybe one day you want to share it because you think it can be helpful. But again, it's kind of like, I think it's always important to ask the question of like, am I the person to make this content or this game? Anyway, that was my very long answer to that.
No, thank you so much. That's so interesting. And it made me think of a game that I was recently invited to, and I actually chose not. Well, it was a practical choice, but also a personal choice. The LARP was called The Future is Straight, which looks amazing. It's a Nordic LARP about gay conversion therapy, something that, all too many people have intimate and even current experience of, that I could definitely relate to in a really traumatic sense. But it's like, okay, that choice of like, yes, this is about my experience, but am I going to self-include? It sounds like a lot of really intense but very possibly transformative experiences could be had through that kind of play. So thank you for that. really good answer. If it's okay, I'll go to another question then.
Yeah.
Someone here saying, thank you for an amazing talk. I would agree with that sentiment. I'd like to know a little more about how you delineate horror games as a genre. I recognize so much of what you've said about the healing and cathartic aspects as applicable to LARPs that are not classified as horror per se, but more as oppression, dystopia, Nordic misery, they put in quotes, and super useful in regards to those. So
yeah, and that's something I spend a lot of time thinking about, is that fear-based play can be in so many different games that are not just horror games, right? Like you can have, if death is present at all in a game, the threat of death, that's also fear-based if you're worried about, am I going to have to lose this person, mourn this person, or multiple people. But horror does a thing where it amplifies everything through this lens of, often if it's, because usually most of the horror LARPs I've played in have been supernatural in some sense or another, or at least surreal enough that it very much is on that line of if this could be supernatural. And that amplifies things in a certain way where the threat becomes something that we don't have protocols to deal with in real life. Generally speaking, I mean, some people do come from cultures where there are ideas of like, oh, if you're having a haunting in your house, like you have to follow these different steps and this is how you deal with it. But like on a day-to-day basis, I think most of us generally are, we're dealing with things that we have some kind of idea of what the protocol is for. And so horror kind of throws us into a scenario where the very base of the idea generally is that we don't know what we're doing. We don't know how to take care of this thing. And that's kind of how I generally, that's the thing. It's horror is one of those things where it's kind of like, I know it when I see it, but it's hard to define sometimes. Because like there are a lot of LARPs that take place, for instance, in fallout shelters. And Sarcophagus comes to mind, I believe is the one I'm thinking of. And then I have one called But Not Tonight, which takes place in the 80s and during the Cold War. And that draws from fear-based play, but would I describe that as a horror LARP specifically? Probably not. It feels a little bit more, again, and even the word thriller doesn't quite make sense, even though if we were talking in cinematic terms, people would probably categorize it that way, but it is more of a drama or a not dystopian, what am I thinking? A disaster LARP. And so with horror, I think, again, it's just that threat gets kind of put on a weird-ish pedestal where, again, like the threat is almost made to be, it's elevated to this state of something that's a little bit ineffable. And that's generally how I tonally feel. It's different from other LARPs that also incorporate fear-based play, is that ineffability of it. Which again was a very long answer for that. I'm sorry.
Not at all. Please don't apologize for long and interesting answers to these things. The notion of what is and what is not a horror game. I can imagine you write a PhD thesis on that. Thank you so much. Not unrelated to this notion of archetypes and common, what makes something horror. The question is, what are your thoughts on games like Wraith, where shadow work and psychodrama was a core element of the gameplay, but was often, in this case, misused to a lack of safety tools? Could a game like Wraith be contemporized with modern safety tools, or should RPGs avoid PC to PC, player character to player character shadow work?
So full disclosure, I'm not very, very familiar with Wraith, so I can't speak to the specifics of that very well, but I am familiar with shadow work and psychodrama. And I've given, I was going to say a variation of a lecture, but it was actually pretty different, to Geek Therapeutics, which is a group that they specifically do trainings for therapists and social workers and counselors who want to integrate role-playing games. And generally, well, I focus on that. They do all sorts of integration of geek culture into therapy. And I think that in clinical settings, you have like a lot of room for things that might not feel particularly safe in in groups where there's nobody there who has training for therapeutic work and counseling. It doesn't mean that people aren't going to go ahead and explore that anyway. So I think it is useful for people to have, like, who want to engage in that, to have the ability to see what people have done so far when it comes to integrating psychodrama, and role playing. Because again, like I just, from hearing personal anecdotes and reading them, there are a lot of people who seek out role-playing experiences as a form of of therapy. It's not a suitable replacement for therapy altogether, but it's kind of a supplemental activity where people get to work out things about themselves and discover things about themselves. And I think even when people wouldn't necessarily know what shadow work is or psychodrama is, they end up kind of naturally including those things. I think safety, the way that safety tools and knowledge and use of them has evolved over time has helped the situation a lot. It's very hard for me to outright say yes, everybody should engage in psychodrama to its full extent if they are in a uncontrolled, or not an uncontrolled environment, but an unsupervised by a clinician environment in a way, because I do know that you don't know what you don't know, and you don't necessarily know what you're doing that could be harmful for you or another person unless you have that knowledge base. I think that there are things that probably could be pulled from Wraith and games that want to incorporate shadow work and psychodrama without it advertising itself as kind of the full experience. I'm not saying that Wraith did. Again, I don't know very much about Wraith, but I do know, I have heard people talk about wanting to create games that are specifically these kinds of tools. And they're still very much in the works, and they're going through a lot of iterations because it's a very complicated process. And ethically, it is a little bit sometimes in a gray space, because it's a new frontier. And it's kind of different when you're advertising something as being akin to a clinical tool than saying this is a transformative experience, because transformative is not, it can be, but it's not necessarily the same thing as clinically therapeutic, right? So again, another long answer that I need to hydrate after.
Okay. Thank you so much. The next person asked 2 questions. So just for the sake of giving everybody a chance, I'm just going to limit it to one. And I think you just answered one of these a little bit. They were asking questions, I think specifically in relation to something is wrong here, but I mean, I imagine it could be applied to many other games. Their question, is there not a chance in games dealing with mental health related fears that could further trigger those fears in the player? And they ask, should there be any kind of supervision for something like that?
Yeah, I mean, one of the reasons I always emphasize, and it's not a solution that's going to work every single time, but one of the reasons I always emphasize clearly advertising what's in a game so that players can self-select is so that players aren't necessarily going to be bombarded by a subject that might be personal to them. So for instance, if I knew the game was going to be intense going into it, I saw what the content notes on it were because it was very clearly at the front. And I was able to, and I did give it some thought. I didn't just go oh, it's intense, let's go ahead and jump in. I did give it some thought about, okay, this is obviously going to touch on some things that are close to me. How comfortable do I feel being in the scenario where other people are going to be presenting elements? Again, it's not like reading a book or watching a movie where I can just turn off the experience. Door is always open is a great mechanic because it means you leave if you need to leave. People just, no questions asked, people will leave if it becomes too intense or too anything. But when you have a lot of different people creating a shared narrative together, there is a risk of people bringing up things and new elements that you weren't expecting. Because everybody is creative in different ways. And so I did have to I think it's important to do an assessment of, am I okay in this environment, in this scenario, if something comes up that is along these themes that I already can find to be upsetting. Also, how many of my, how much of this can be potentially controlled by using safety mechanics like the X card or lines and veils. And if I go through those questions and I still find that I'm very nervous about it, it means that I just won't participate in that game. Have I run into people who have, tried to answer those questions for themselves, thought everything was going to be okay, and then entered a game and then had a very, bad or triggering experience? I have, there are people who have experienced that, and I've talked to several of them. And it's another reason why safety mechanics for what's happening in game are very important, because if something needs to stop, then it needs to stop. If something needs to be calibrated, then it's useful to have tools that people are familiar with for doing so, and for it to be established right from the get-go that like it's not only acceptable if these are used, it's highly encouraged and it's going to make the game a better experience. It is, again, like with intense games, there's always going to be a risk of something coming up that's going to be painful in a way that's just not desirable in any way, shape, or form. But I think the same can be said about a lot of forms of media. So it's not that I want to, I don't have the urge to be like, oh, because this game is not for me potentially, then it shouldn't be for anybody. I think the best that we can do is integrating the safety mechanics, clearly labeling what the experience is potentially going to be like, and then there's something I didn't talk about a whole lot here, but I like the idea of preemptively X-carding things by the game master or somebody who's potentially the designer, outlining here are the subjects that are most likely to come up in this game that are sensitive, and then that as a designer, you are the person who's most aware of what's most likely to come up, whereas the player who's never played through it before is going in only knowing what information you've given them. So if you can provide that list for people of like, body horror might come up, death by such and such thing or such and such thing might come up, talk about mental illness, specifically these ones and themes of this could come up, then you're kind of creating, for lack of a better word coming to mind, like a menu for people to look at and say, if all these things are potentially going to come up, that means that other things might come up that I don't want. Therefore, it's not right for me. Or they can look at it and say, actually, I think this game will be okay if I scratch out these things and we take those topics off the table. That can be very helpful for players.
Wow, thank you again for another really thorough answer there. There's a few more questions for me because I'm like, oh, this is so curious. So, but I'm going to withhold a little to ask the next question from someone here. They are asking, in relation to the stronger the alibi, the weaker the bleed. They're asking, what are your thoughts about having players in roles that provide the antagonism in the game, i.e. playing the baddies or even hidden baddies? And excellent use of the word baddies there from a Brit. I like that.
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot recently about games with like a betrayal, there you go, betrayal mechanic in it, where the idea is like a group goes in, one or more people are actually traitors of some sort, and then there's a big reveal about that, either at the end of the game or sometime throughout the course of the game. I do think that, and I'm sure there are people who would think this is kind of unfair to say, but from personal experience, I do think that the people who are in those roles should generally be a little bit more experienced role players, because there is a lot of room for things to go wrong. And I like the idea of there being, sounds so like clinical, but like some form of training for people who are taking on those roles so that they can steer them in the best way possible, in a way that is going to provide the interactions that people think that they're signing up for, rather than kind of just giving them the reins and saying like, well, just do your best and see what like feels right in the moment. Because some people their idea of what it is to like be a traitor could be, at a level 15, whereas other people in the game think that whatever this betrayal is going to end up being is going to be more at like a level 6. And so again, it's the most important thing, I think, is establishing the expectations, and then providing tools and like as much thorough context as you can for the people who are taking on those roles, so that they know what is appropriate or what isn't appropriate, what is going to fall within the scope of the game, and foster the type of gameplay experience that the designers have created and the players have signed up for, versus when something's going to just potentially just completely go off the rails. It's just kind of a nice additional safety net to know that the people have been briefed in some sense.
I can imagine. Thank you. We're running a little bit out of time, so I've got some short, well, who knows if they're shorter questions, try. Someone's asking if you have any recommendations for solo games that could create space for exploring or confronting specific phobias.
Yeah, so I think I haven't seen every single game in Suburban Consumption of the Monstrous, which was the anthology I mentioned earlier. But I think there are multiple solo games in there. And from what it's still mysterious since not all the games again have been released. There is a like a player package, like a kind of a sample package of games, and it's 2 games, including the Goodbye Father one I mentioned. And there's another one of those that is a solo player game. So and it's on itch.io if you want to look at that and kind of get an idea of whether it seems like something that might be for you. I need to look more into solo games that would specifically be a good fit for confronting specific phobias. But off the top of my head, some of the people who make solo games in general are Jeon Shim. That's Jeeyon. Shim is Shim. And she does a lot of excellent solo games. And I think Banana Chan and Doug Lewandowski did a solo game together that was specifically a horror Christmas like advent calendar game. I don't know whether it's still available or not, but I do know it integrated horror elements into it. Itch.io has a lot of very interesting and good solo journaling games. And so I wouldn't be surprised if there's some very good material for that on there. But I can't name anything specifically just since I'm not sure about like what the specific phobias, what might be available.
Fabulous. And itch.io is a resource for so many things. Perhaps the final question then. Someone is asking if you could elaborate on romanticizing fear. It was from one of your slides. So perhaps they were just curious about the concept. How you're using it.
For sure. So I think there are a lot of when the idea of like romanticizing something that is like harmful comes up, usually it's in the context of like, oh my God, this is the worst thing you could possibly do. Because it's making, like, I think one of the things I remember, not game related, but just medium related. And so it ties into this a bit, like there was a show and a book called 13 Reasons Why. And there was discussion about like, oh, this romanticizes suicide, teen suicide. And it's very harmful for young people who are watching this and who might be impressionable. And so I think a lot of the times when we talk about romanticizing something that is hard or difficult or harmful, that's where people's minds immediately go. And I do agree that like romanticizing things like suicide is not a healthy thing. But when you are living through like your own mental health issues or chronic illness, for instance, again, I'm going to just like speak from personal experience. That's what I can speak to the most thoroughly. I have chronic illness that makes life very difficult from time to time. And I personally struggle with anxiety disorders and several other things. But sometimes when I find myself able to kind of almost, again, this is going to sound potentially very problematic, but if I take a moment to kind of put the thing I am struggling through on a bit of a pedestal and look at it and try to find a way that it might actually be beautiful in some sense, that helps me get through those flare-ups or, those bad times, those bad episodes more easily because, and I don't encourage people diving in very much down like the romantics poet and like romanticizing tuberculosis, for instance, where now it's like informed all our like beauty standards of being of Western beauty standards rather of like, oh, is it so nice to be very skinny and pale because that looks consumptive and isn't that romantic? I don't think that's good, but I think if you can look at something that you're struggling with just within yourself and find ways where maybe it's actually a little bit poetic, or it's a little bit, it's something that is actually brought out something good or worthwhile in you at some point. I think taking time to reflect on those instances where there is something that's potentially, again, doesn't necessarily make it worth it, doesn't mean that it's a good thing that you've experienced, but where you can see some bit of silver lining to it. For some people, that's going to be a terrible exercise, but I think for a lot of people, including myself, putting it in that light, seeing the things that have like caused a lot of struggle and suffering for me in a light that's a little bit flattering for it, eases my experience with it quite a bit. And again, that could be a whole other lecture, I'm sure.
Oh my goodness, so many things. And I have so many unanswered questions on my list. To anybody who I couldn't ask your question, I apologize. We could go on and on, I can tell. And I wish I could ask many more questions, but we are at our time limit. So I'd like to, I'm sure, speak for many of the people in chat who've already said this. Thank you so much for your really interesting talk and for answering so many questions. It's been such a pleasure. And thank you very much. So
thank you so much.
A lot of applause in chat and applause from me. I'd like to finish up quickly before we end our session here, that if you're interested in watching this particular talk again, or the very large growing selection of talks that we now have, you can see them on the Transformative Play Initiative channel on YouTube. If you haven't got a link directly, just look up Transformative Play Initiative on YouTube and you will find us all there. The next talk, and I'm sorry I may not say this name correctly, but Katrin Genesis, I apologize to them immediately. Did I say that wrong, Sarah?
Noise, I think.
Oh, okay. I will learn before next time to say their name correctly. It'll be a talk on educational role-playing on March the 29th. Very much looking forward to that. So thank you very much to everyone, and wish you all a good night.